And I'm really excited to announce the next panel on governance, hosted by Alessandra. Alessandra has been in the space, in the crypto space for 6 years, is it? Both advising and investing in projects and also advising corporates in the space. She's been looking at the subject of governance for some time since she wrote a thesis on the topic. And she's also CEO and founder of a company called Evermore in the health space. So Alessandra, I'll leave it to you to introduce the panel.
All right. Come on over, guys. Leave it to you guys to introduce yourselves. You might want to start.
Yeah, great. Am I on? Hi, I'm Christina Frankopan. I'm a venture partner with Fabric Ventures. And my background is in finance, and I got interested over a long period in incentive design, initially for corporates, and then I got quite interested in novel ideas of financial ethics and impact investment, which is sort of how I came into the crypto community, because I was excited about the idea of designing incentives to direct capital to interesting places. And I've been advising VCs, working with Fabric for the last couple of years, so since 2015 in the Ethereum space mostly.
My name is Jack DeRose. I'm co-founder and CEO of a project called Colony, which is what we call a platform for open organizations. The general gist is that we believe the world of work is going to become more open. Organizations in general are going to be more open. And Colony provides a very broad tool set that enables people to create organizations which are mediated by software rather than by the traditional sort of paperwork and legal system. And we see that spanning the gamut from sort of fairly traditionally socially centralized organizations all the way up to this sort of very exciting new paradigm of the decentralized autonomous organization or decentralized organization, in which many people are able to collaborate together online without needing to know or trust one another.
Hi, my name is Marcel Dietsch. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Covee Network. We're a Zurich-based blockchain project. Our mission is quite similar to Colony, and our view of the world is quite a similar one. We believe in a world of decentralized organizations where people can work on projects together without joining a company anymore. Our focus is in particular on knowledge work, because that's location agnostic, location independent. It can be done from anywhere. It can be decentralized. And we have about 10 people in Zurich at the moment. And my background was in finance and academia.
Nice. Hi, my name is Jouni. I work with Aragon as a design lead. Aragon is also based near Zurich in Zug at the moment. We're about 15 people. We're designing software and tooling for people from developers to end users to basically create very easily organizations and manage organizations on blockchain. At the moment, we're live on Ethereum. We have just launched a survey app for signaling, getting sentiment from token holders last week. And yeah, for us, it's a very, very interesting kind of exploration into what governance would look like for blockchain projects.
Right, so we're here to talk about governance today. But what is governance, right? So I'd like to start actually defining governance, and I think that most of you will have slightly different definitions of it. So if we can just start with a couple of phrases with what each of you guys think governance is. You want to start?
Sure. As you said, a very broad topic. I think essentially when there's more than one participant, you have decisions to make in any kind of organization, whether it's like a very small startup or a non-profit or an open source project, all the way to kind of national or city level organizations. And we need some tooling mechanisms for people to jointly come together to make decisions in a fair, transparent way. Effectively, that's what we're looking at. It might be voting, it might be other types of things, but that's what we're building.
Marcel, what do you think?
Well, it's basically a set of rules and mechanisms that allow people to interact and coordinate their behavior. And these rules and mechanisms could be expressed through politics, through markets, through networks. If you want to go all the way back, you used to have kings who basically punish bad behavior, because that's ultimately what governance is about. How do you get people to produce something valuable together?
Yep.
And so over time, we develop different mechanisms and tools to allow people to cooperate and coordinate. And I think that's governance.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that it's a term that's getting used a lot in the sort of blockchain circles at the moment, and I think it's used in a terribly nebulous way. Nobody, I think, really does have a common understanding of what it means, or indeed what it's for. So it ranges from decision-making around things like, should the protocol be upgraded with this, whatever new patch it has, or should it be forked, or everything. So runs the whole gamut from that all the way down to really, I suppose, what Colony is doing, which is even the very most granular pieces of work. Because I think for me, what governance means is the decisions that take place pursuant to actually getting things done. And if those decisions are only sort of at the very broadest brushstrokes, and it's considered to be decentralized, how are all the smallest decisions being made in a similarly decentralized fashion?
Yes, I agree that the term is being used nebulously, particularly in our community, but I mean, I guess in the simplest terms, governance is just, as you were saying, a set of rules, guidance and oversight systems for managing any type of community. And that community, I suppose, could be either a network, an organization, a firm, or indeed a government. And a good governance system, I suppose, has also protocols, which is also a loaded term, but protocols for defining how the system is managed in the circumstance of unforeseen events, including hacks and other kinds of events. So good governance policy encompasses also unforeseeable events.
Yep. So maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into where governance is going and how each of your views reflect into the projects that you run. Maybe we can start with Colony.
Sure. So yeah, our view generally is that governance is about getting things done, and actually even internally we have arguments about what the word governance means. I like to say that we should consider Colony to be a governance project simply because that's the term that's used in the space. And then my co-founder will argue with me that, in fact, no, what we're doing is trying to enable the actual daily operation of any organization. So really that's kind of at the heart of what we do. And we're trying to make organizations which are truly decentralized. And so the base level question there is, how do you decentralize an organization? Most commonly, people will talk about governance being some kind of voting mechanism. And voting is a problematic question in a trustless environment, because ordinarily when you vote on something, you would like to be able to say that there is an individual and this individual has some influence, perhaps it's just purely democratic and everybody is like one person, one vote, or perhaps it's something different and different people have different weightings to their votes. But that is really, really problematic to do in a decentralized and trustless system because we have Sybil attacks. So people can create many, many different addresses, accounts, and they can have an unfair amount of influence if we're just reliant on identities. That's a very, very hard problem to solve. So what people do typically is weight decisions, weight votes by token holdings, so essentially by wealth. And similarly, that seems like it's problematic. It feels very much like it's swapping one problem for another problem, which is that I don't think most organizations, at least in a sort of an operational sense, operate according to who is the wealthiest, because really wealth is no proxy for expertise, particularly in any specific realm, whether it be design or development or whatever. So the base principle of Colony's approach to governance is that in a decentralized way, we need to be able to emulate the sort of hierarchical structure that we find in ordinary organizations, because that hierarchical structure exists to get stuff done, really to get stuff done in a reasonably efficient way by vesting influence in certain people who have got to that position in the sort of Platonic ideal of a perfect hierarchy, I suppose, who've got to that position by pure virtue of their merit. So Colony tries to take a very sort of empirical approach to establishing the merit of people on the basis of the work they've done within a given organization and modulating their influence over decisions which pertain to the organization or their domains within the organization according to that demonstrable merit.
I'd like to ask this question to Aragon as well.
Sure.
How do you guys view the work?
Yeah, it's really interesting points Jack raised. I think we are at such a kind of early stages of governance on the blockchain that it's really difficult to say what type of design or mechanism will be the best. So what we're really focused on is creating infrastructure or tooling for people to build whatever types of governance models they like very quickly at low cost, and then deploy them and test them in kind of secure environments where we have real capital risk, but not necessarily like so much that if things go wrong, the whole project is going to fail. So kind of sandboxing things in a very easy way, I think, is the way to go about it early on. I think it'll be kind of a Cambrian explosion of governance models initially, where people will be trying different things out and see what works. And we've taken the approach that we should try and build tooling for people to do that very quickly, very easily, in a kind of safe manner, where you've got upgradable contracts. You can have a permissioning system where you can allocate only partial permissions or partial capital that the organization has to these tests. And I think we'll discover optimal ways. Maybe some type of governance models will not be right for each type of organization. So I think maybe there will be several different types of governance models that will work. And in general, I'm a big believer in basically letting evolution do its job. I think it's quite a big search space of potential things we can do, and I think enabling the tooling to go through this search space really quickly, I think we'll get to interesting results.
Yeah, so, and on that note, maybe we can talk about the rapid iteration that we are introducing in the governance space as well for the first time in DLT. So when I wrote my corporate governance thesis 8 years ago, I actually looked into all the systems across the world. There's the US, the Anglo-American system, there's the continental European model, which we have in Europe, the Japanese model for governance. They all reflect the values and the ethics of their countries. Like you can see the culture reflected in the governance model, the corporate governance model that these countries and these regions have adopted. However, back then, thinking about how we can get better, how we can improve, for me, as an entrepreneur, I thought, not going to go working for the government or in the legal sector in a stricter way. And so archived the topic for a couple of years, because 6 years ago, when I first visited and read Satoshi's paper, I realized that we are effectively creating a huge brownfield for experimenting with governance systems, aren't we? And so the question is, what does it mean to finally have a playground to develop and iterate on new governance models? Maybe Marcel.
Well, I think blockchains have basically created an exciting new design space for governance models. Yeah. Lots of models that can be tried in a very fast and iterative way. I think the good news is that there's a lot of research on game theory, mechanism design, basically microeconomic subfields that have concerned themselves with questions of incentives, of also incompleteness of contracts, because if you try to come up with a rule for every possible scenario, you're not going to be able to do that for in many cases, yeah, because some things are not contractable, yeah, essentially. But there's also bad news, because when you have governance, mechanism design, game theoretic models in a crypto network, you also open yourself up to new attack vectors. Yep. So in a sense, you have this new possibility to create governance rules to involve people in decision making. But at the same time, you have to bear in mind that it creates new attack vectors that when you thought about mechanism design and game theory 20 or 30 years ago, or even today, in abstract. What's a good mechanism? What's a good incentive? You have to consider the fact that this happens in a crypto network where all kinds of attacks can happen. And so that's, I guess that's the good news and the bad news. But I can go into a little bit more detail on how we sort of think about this. So we basically thought about why do we need traditional organizations like companies to do knowledge work? Because knowledge work is considered anywhere. Information, the marginal cost of sharing information is basically zero. You can share it. You just make a digital copy of something. That's very inexpensive. So that should mean you can do knowledge work from anywhere in the world. But how do you get people to work together like trusted friends or like colleagues who've signed the same employment contracts? So you basically have to come up with that sort of set of rules and procedures to enable people to have this exchange of value. I bring in 20 hours of my work, somebody else brings in a statistical model, somebody else brings in a data set. How do you secure that exchange of value? And so we've built this on decades of research of mechanism design and game theory, and we've worked with a couple of academics who've designed auctions, electronic markets before, including a Nobel Prize winner from Stanford, to think about what rules do you really need to replace the functions of the firm for knowledge work, not necessarily for physical products, because that requires capital investment. So decentralizing, building an iPhone is going to be really difficult, but decentralizing a knowledge work team is quite feasible. And what are the rules needed for that? And that's sort of our approach with coming from an incentive kind of perspective.
Yep. Christina, you see many different projects.
Yes, no, I'm thinking about how we can apply what's really going in blockchain to these new kinds of organizations. What is it that's unique about blockchain that we can bring to these new kinds of organizational design? So things like distributed knowledge work or sort of Amazon Turk stuff is well established and doesn't necessarily need these kinds of incentive systems. But I think what's quite exciting is that you can design and you can challenge the theory of the firm, which is what you're saying, by inventing completely new kinds of distributed organizations and mechanisms for organizing those and delivering oversight mechanisms. But I think, in a way, what's even more exciting, to me at least, is new kinds of ideas of organizing society more broadly. So ideas like liquid democracy in ways that we can allocate votes to other people and or apply reputation systems and ID systems on top of those to design completely new kinds of public governance mechanisms. I think that's potentially very exciting. I think a lot of the ideas, those are huge challenges. Those, as you mentioned, the reputation and the ID systems are complex problems.
Yep.
And maybe we'll have more and more granular applications for which we want to apply specific aspects of identity, for example, or reputation systems. So I think we're going to, I mean, already we're seeing an enormous amount of experimentation in that space, but I think it's still very early in terms of considering what we can and can't do. And these sorts of projects obviously are some of the more advanced ones, but I think it's providing a platforms for radical innovation, I think.
Yeah. And maybe on this note, we can branch out for a second into politics and society. So usually what I say when I'm discussing democracy, privately I say, my idealistic side likes democracy, our morals and values. My pragmatic side thinks democracy is not necessarily an updated system to deal with an increasingly complex reality as we have it today. Science and technology being a big part of that and where we're going. So the question there is, how do we see this transition? As you just pointed out, it's early days, but we've got projects like you guys dealing with this. So where do you see us going in terms of like a more direct impact to society, politics, and the world as a whole? No pressure.
Wow, well, that's quite a question. So people do often think of or sort of accuse us as a team and as a project of this being sort of quite a political statement. And I don't know that we've ever thought of it quite in those terms. I think that there are, you know, Aragon, for instance, I think that there's quite a strong political charge behind that, right? That there's, you know, it's a movement that people of sort of persuasion should be marching towards in order to sort of provide for this better, fairer sort of world which almost is kind of parallel, like a sort of parallel jurisdiction which is purely existing on the blockchain. I think that for us, we kind of see the inherent pseudonymity of a blockchain as being a very powerful and potentially very beneficial thing, because it enables people to be judged on the quality of their output, of the quality of their person, rather than any sort of other overt signals that we might sort of suffer from unconscious biases around. So we can't really suffer from unconscious bias when all that we really know of somebody is that they're an address on a blockchain. And I think that if we figure out the game theory of these systems well, I think that has a really powerful potential to democratize access to success, I think, wherever you are. And that's very exciting to me.
Yeah. What about Aragon? How do you guys think about this?
So how to bring blockchain governance to real-world politics? Is that the question? Right. I think it's a really interesting one. I think it's, like you said, it's still very early days. I don't think it would be a good idea to take national elections on blockchain today, for instance. I don't think it's ready for it. But I think we could start on a smaller scale, like, for instance, the city of Zug are doing some city-level voting. I think experimenting, like you said, liquid democracy is a very interesting concept that hasn't really been used in real-world politics to kind of large degree so far. I think it would be a great experiment. Again, I think on a smaller level.
How do we get there? What are the missing
Right.
steps? Right.
I think in a way Jack has a good approach in starting from like private, and you guys as well, starting from private organizations like individuals rather than political stage. But I think because it's much easier to move at that level, I think. But also I think there are places in the world where you have more forward-looking governance, like Zug, for instance, where you can start trialing this type of stuff out in the real world in terms of not just a startup or whatever one may be, like for private entity on blockchain, but actual political governance.
Yeah. Maybe to go into something a bit more concrete and relevant today. So we've all heard about the Dow accident and Dows in general. I think you guys have an interesting view on that and where that's going.
Okay. Yes, so I think...
Maybe let's start by defining the Dow.
Okay. I would say that a DAO means a decentralized autonomous organization. Again, this is another term which is used incredibly nebulously. And I think actually Vitalik, way back in the day, the founder of Ethereum, did a really good job of sort of defining actually what a DAO is. And really nobody, including Colony, uses it correctly. And we don't use it correctly, and I suspect nobody else really uses it correctly. It's just because that's become the term that people use, much like governance, I suppose. What a DAO really is a sort of organization which is composed primarily of non-human agents who are doing some stuff, they're doing some work, and the human participation in that is sort of ancillary. It's really there to feed the non-human agents with electricity or bandwidth or whatever. What people more commonly refer to as a DAO is what we would call a decentralized organization, or DO, I guess. And that is where you have got a bunch of smart contracts that are actually used to mediate the relationships, the collaboration between people. And I think that there's probably a continuum of DAO to do. And it really depends on the extent to which people are necessary within that system to sort of know whereabouts you fall on that continuum.
What are your thoughts on the way that you work with that at Covee?
So the idealist in me likes the idea of a DAO very much, but there are obviously a few issues with putting that in place. I think the first issue is that who makes the rules about the rules, right? So the DAO has a certain set of rules, and I think you guys are thinking about it in terms of experimentation and giving people that possibility to try this out. We're a little bit skeptical that people really want to spend a lot of time trying and testing these rules and spending a whole week on trying to figure out how we want to work together, how we want to vote. So that's why our approach is to say, okay, well, what's the minimum we need to specify? And this is again about incentives. How do we get people to behave in a cooperative and a sort of constructive way? And that's based on incentive design and economic mechanisms that get people to behave well.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And we're building again on many decades of academic research, and we're sort of putting these rules out in the open. We're saying, these are the rules, and you can use them. So we're not being secretive about it, but we're giving people, at least initially, less choice about how they want to create their own team to work together, because of that issue of who makes the rules about the rules and how much time do you want to spend on that. So that's how we think about decentralized collaboration.
Yeah. Maybe just.
Sure. I guess DAOs today are the fundamental building block of what Aragon is right now. As I said, it's still early days, but effectively you can try right now. If you go to aragon.one, you can deploy your own DAO in about 3 minutes. We have some default templates for democracy, multisig, things like that, where, as you said, we don't really expect all users to just kind of drop in a vacuum and design their own governance system themselves. We've got templates for people to use, but at the same time, I think we expect, for instance, we built our own voting app within Aragon, but the whole project is open source, and we're really hoping, we built lots of toolkits and tooling for people to build their own apps. So if somebody wants to build a liquid democracy app, which we're also looking at, then it'd be very easy to integrate into your organization. So I think DAOs are a good building block because they're well understood in the blockchain community. And I think, in general, I think that early users of this type of tooling will be token projects, other token projects within the blockchain economy. And I think, or maybe open source technical users, but I think it will start from there and then kind of expand to wider society. I think that at least my kind of take on how things will pan out initially.
Yep. So I'd like to address something that sometimes feels a little bit like an elephant in the room, and it's the fact that effectively these new governance field we're creating is technology-driven mainly, at least for what concerns on-chain governance approaches, versus human-driven approaches, which we've had in corporate governance and in various other governance systems, like across history, really. So what are your thoughts, and maybe we can start with Colony, what are your thoughts about the difference and the way that it can potentially play together or just completely disintermediate the human part?
To what extent do I think that technology will disintermediate humans?
Human-driven approach to governance, yeah.
I don't think it will until we have generalized AI.
Yeah.
I don't think it can. I saw something on Twitter the other day, this guy saying he was enormously skeptical of the concept of a DAO because they seek to marginalize or remove the role of human judgment. And it's just bizarre to me, to be honest, because if you just take a step back as to what that requires to remove human judgment from some software, you've got quite a leap. And to the best of my knowledge, no one in the blockchain space is trying to do that. Yeah, so that's the short answer. It won't, not for a very long time.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to sort of echo, I suppose, some of the comments made earlier on the human piece. The rules have to be designed by human, and indeed they need to be coded by human or humans, and people make mistakes. So talking about a DAO, some of you might be familiar with the DAO, which was, if you like, a premature experiment in novel governance design for an organization to allocate assets according to how the community wanted it to. There was a line of error in the code, it got hacked, and what was it, $50 million got stolen, if you like, before it got rehacked, and then we forked. But I mean, the point about that is I think there are two points really. One is that on the human element, there will always be mistakes. And I think as a community, just in the kind of blockchain space, let alone for broader applications in society and organizations, I don't think we've come to terms with the concept of systemic risk in the design of these systems. So we all know that there are plenty of rubbish projects out there in this space. And when one or more of them come tumbling down with more than one line of code error, that is going to create systemic risk for the rest of us. And I think we need to recognize that human element in terms of how the governance designs and crypto-economic designs of each of those projects have been designed. But there's another thing I just wanted to raise briefly on the DAO thing as well. You know, on the human side, the legal identity of DAOs is not clear, and I think that there's a lot of human engagement that's going to be required for the regulators and legal community and us to catch up with the consequences of where legal liability crystallizes in a human or in an organization as opposed to some virtual piece of code.
Yep. What are your thoughts, Marcel?
Well, so there's the issue of contractability that I referred to earlier. So how do you set rules for things that you don't know yet? So that's fundamentally an issue with anything that is completely decentralized and regulated by technology. Second thing is attack vectors, and how do you think about those? But the third one is actually, to use a sort of more tangible example, what happens if you lose your private keys, right? So let's say your house is tokenized and you lose your private keys. You can't get into your house anymore. You can't even sell it anymore. So there are all kinds of issues around how do you deal with these sort of accidents, right? There's the contractability problem, the attack vectors, but also the fact that you might lose stuff, and if your private keys are gone, how do you interact with your DAO, your team, or whatever you do, really? So there are all kinds of issues that when technology has the last word in any transaction.
Dealing with human error.
Exactly. Well, partly with human error, but other issues as well. So there are all kinds of issues around that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that sentiment. I think the usability of blockchain is still in its early stages. I think private keys being a great example. But I don't think it's issues we can't solve through design, like better design, experimentation. I think in terms of like who do we give the last word to in terms of something goes wrong, whether it's the machine or a human, I think ultimately it'll always be human at the end of the day. But then we can also design things into, like smart contracts today by default are immutable, so you can't really upgrade them. But for instance, with Aragon, we've worked on upgradable smart contracts where we've then built voting mechanisms into the upgrading. So if something goes wrong, then you can have a vote on whether we should change the way the smart contract operates, for instance. So I think it's early days, but I'm positive.
Yep. So I'd like to open it up to questions. This is a very broad topic, and we can take it in any direction. And I'm sure you guys have some of those in mind. So if you have questions, please. Yeah.
So take the note. I'm wondering how, given your representing DAO organization, how do you see this market evolving in terms of sort of ownership? Will individual DAOs become very dominant in particular markets, or how will it play out if they become sort of widely used?
It's a really interesting question. So most projects are sort of open source, and they have their public network, and most projects are looking to incentivize participation in their network, because really that's where the crypto economics lies, and that's how value accrues to the token if it is designed in such a way that that is possible, which is not always the case. So I think that it's more a case of different networks competing with one another rather than different applications. And actually, I think one of the most exciting things about Ethereum, I suppose, as a space particularly, is the opportunity for there to be many different protocols, many different networks, and sort of creative developers looking to build sort of a layer above that, combining attributes and features from a whole bunch of different networks into an application that provides something radically different than was initially known. And I think that it's probably unlikely that multiple networks which are broadly similar in their functionality or identical in their functionality will succeed, at least within Ethereum, but I think it's very likely that those which answer slightly different questions will exist in parallel and will be combined by people building applications.
Questions? Yeah.
My question relates to sort of governance in general about blockchain and whether actually blockchain enables these new governance models because of its unique features, or whether blockchain could actually be implemented using our current technologies without blockchain, but it's just that it's promoted, this whole wave of DLT has promoted a rethinking about governance arrangements, networks of businesses, and so forth. Do you really think that actually blockchain itself, the technology and the way it's put together, does enable all of these new governance models, or is it really something that's associated with that rather than being part of it?
I'll take it if you like, but then I'll end up answering all of it.
Not sure I made myself clear,
which is that I think the reason why governance is important in the blockchain space is because there is something to govern, and there's a reason why it matters, because there is some scarce shared resource, some scarce shared thing that people need to be able to control. And really anything you can imagine that can be done on a blockchain and more can be done without a blockchain. It's just that there is a requirement for trust in some company or some set of entities. And the removal of that trust is what creates the opportunity and the requirement for there to be things to govern. I mean, trustlessness is the absolute fundamental, most important thing about a blockchain.
It's a tighter definition going into censorship resistance, and just like actually having a security issue or a need to replace trust and to replace the intermediary, which is how we define it more tightly. But when that is not met in a way that is satisfactory enough, then I would always argue that a centralized database, especially for like many sectors, for corporates looking into moving into blockchain, can perform in a way that is more rapid and effective. And therefore, being clear about how the trust replacement is happening and why, and what's the value that is being delivered by that, is really important. Yeah?
I have a specific question related to asset tokens. Mentioned if you lose the private keys, so the risk you have, okay? I just want to make a hypothetical example, and let's tell me if I'm wrong. If the issuance of asset tokens comes under securities regulation, and the asset token is a claim on either property, and I'm thinking about property markets, or a stream of cash flows, would that really mitigate the risk? The regulated under securities.
If I understood you correctly, you're asking if what happens to an underlying asset. Okay.
under securities regulation, where he has a claim on an asset, which is, let's say, a property, or it's paying on revenues. Wouldn't that mitigate if he loses the private?
Right, but then, so, okay, I'll say something potentially unpopular, but then the security token with a claim on an underlying asset, whether that's some sort of company shares or some regular real estate. Okay, but then that, if you still need another ledger that says, well, that's really my claim on that asset, you don't really need a token or a blockchain for it. If you lose the private key and you still need to go to another ledger to say, well, that's actually my house, then I'm skeptical whether you need the token and the blockchain for that in the first place.
Well, blockchain you need if you want to bring the stakeholders in transactions all together on the same technology.
Yes, but if you need a second ledger to record what you have, then you might not need the blockchain or the security token in the first place. If you're worried about losing your private key.
Ethereum has been used in Dubai for real asset management, for real estate. So you're saying that you don't really need blockchain there?
Well, if you lose your private key and you still want to have a claim on your asset, you still want to recover your asset, you need another ledger. So that calls into question why you need the blockchain ledger in the first place.
Yep.
I just had a question regarding identity verification, because it seems to me that in terms of governance, if you want to create a scalable, economically scalable system, you need to be able to ensure against things like laundering and other issues. So could you give us a sense of how robust identity verification looks like right now and where you see it going, please?
I have a view on this one, which is I think actually that there are lots of identity projects and identity is useful. But I think actually within a trustless system, identity is an intractable problem because it's not a question of whether I can prove that there exists an ID and that I have associated an ID with an account. I can definitely do all of that thing. But what I can't do is prove beyond a question of a doubt that the person controls that address or is not being controlled by somebody else. So I think that there's, around sort of the whole ICO space, there's a huge amount of effort and companies springing up to enable people to, prove source of funds and do KYC and AML and what have you. But I think it's largely paying lip service to an old system, and it doesn't really do anything of particular use.
Yeah, and if I may add, to be very honest, the old system is pretty flawed too. I mean, actually KYC, what it actually involves is a copy of a passport and a utility bill. I mean, if you're really a money launderer, it's not very hard to sort that kind of thing out. So, yeah, I think there's still a long way to go, and those sorts of problems are going to be, yeah, I think intractable.
Yeah. Question there.
Can you hear me from here?
Yep.
A question perhaps for the other three speakers. We have discussed this with Jack a little bit. Thank you. But it's on the human perspective in these rule-based systems. And what I encounter with other sort of governance models, take holacracy, sociocracy, and so on, is that you tend to have people divided across a range of the spectrum in between the process buffs who love this and adopt it really quickly, and those who really struggle to adapt to these new set of rules. Now, one would assume that over time people get more and more comfortable, and then as one incorporates the rules, like as one is learning to play any new game, at the beginning it's a little bit awkward, and after a while one can concentrate on the game and not on the rules. Now, you mentioned many times that these are early days and so on, but I was wondering if in the projects that you manage and in some of your personal experience you had encountered some of that acclimatation, and you have encountered, of course, people who get attracted to those tend to be more process buffs, but you have encountered easing into these systems more and more, and that adaptation into these new forms of rules and so on.
Yep, I could answer briefly. I think it's a really good point. I think Essentially using blockchain, any type of blockchain today, whether it's for governance or just merely transferring tokens, is still too difficult, and I think we need to work hard on the usability and the user experience of those transactions. But to be honest, even if it's second nature, it's super easy to use. You can just do it on a smartphone in seconds, like anybody, like non-technical users can do this. I think we'll still have issues with that we can't really foresee today, but if voting becomes very ordinary, you have to do it a lot. Like let's say if you imagine a future where you're involved in, let's say, 5 to 10 different organizations on the blockchain. Each one have votes, several votes per month. Like, how do you manage your time? There will be low turnout for these votes, and then might not pass the quorum, or you end up with situations where people holding a lot of tokens in the instances where tokens directly relate to voting rights end up making majority decisions, where most people who just hold a few tokens can't be bothered to vote. So I think there's a lot of things like that we can't really foresee yet. Liquid democracy, I think, is really interesting in that sense that you can delegate your voting rights to experts that you trust, but you can also withdraw those voting rights back. So really interested in that as a kind of a governance method. But in general, yeah, I think even once the UX problems are solved for ordinary users to take part, I think we will have these kind of secondary problems at that stage.
Yep. Marcel?
I agree. User experience is one of the two big issues. I think the second one is how do you distribute the token? How do you use that sort of token network effect? But on user experience, so when we talk about game theory and mechanism design and all this stuff, coding the smart contract, in the user experience, none of that should show up. It should be frictionless. It should be simple to use. And actually, we found something interesting that I guess a general audience might be confused by MetaMask integration and by all these kind of things, but the blockchain, people see it as a trust mechanism. So it's sort of interesting that the core adopters or the early adopters, they like this sort of extra step because to them that communicates trust. I'm interacting with the smart contract here. But I think a general audience, if you want really lots of users, it has to be super frictionless. You need to hide the complexity as much as possible. On the distributional question, I think the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that Satoshi got the distribution right from the start. So he dropped an incentive structure on the world, and you had this emergent behavior. And because the distribution of the coin was really, really well done. It could have been genius, could have been luck, maybe a bit of both. But we think that a lot of experimentation and study needs to go into how you use that token network effect, rewarding the first 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 users in the right way so that they spread the word. So you don't have to raise lots of venture capital the traditional way and give everybody 10 actual dollars like PayPal did back in the 90s to foster adoption. So using that token network effect by getting the token distribution to early adopters right, I think that's the other thing apart from UX.
Yeah, so we've got time for, one more quick question with a quick answer because we need to wrap up. Anyone? Yeah.
You love them, thank you very much. Apart from your own projects, which projects do you think and feel have absolutely nailed governance now or potentially will going forward?
That's easy, nobody.
No, I mean, I can say from because I'm not one of your projects, I think, these are the premier projects in that governance space, but there is a lot of work being done in the research community, though, on other kinds of models, and that's not necessarily crystallized in a project specifically at the moment. So.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming and discussing governance with us, and thank you to everybody else coming here.